Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Coughlin, and welcome to First Person Civil War Podcast, which retells the stories of the soldiers and officers on the ground in the battles of the Civil War. Episode 29 is entitled First Lieutenant Lemuel A. Abbott and the 10th Vermont at the Third Battle of Winchester, and relies on his book, Personal Recollections and Civil War Diary, 1864, which he published in 1904. Lemuel Abijah Abbott lived in Barre, Vermont, when on 28 July, 1862, he enlisted in the Army at 22 years old. On 1 September 1862, he was mustered into service as the first sergeant of Company B, 10th Vermont. The regiment marched to Washington, D.C., and served in the defenses around the capital for the rest of 1862, until July 1863. Following the defeat of the Army of Northern Virginia at the Battle of Gettysburg, the 10th Vermont was assigned to the 3rd Corps of the Army of the Potomac, until March of 1864, when it was transferred to the 6th Corps. The 10th Vermont was present at the battles of the Overland Campaign and was at Petersburg when the entire corps was diverted to Washington, D.C. In the spring of 1864, the Shenandoah Valley, as part of Lieutenant General Grant's wider advance into Confederate-held territory, became the scene of several engagements. As both armies settled into siege operations at Petersburg, Virginia, General Robert E. Lee sent Lieutenant General Jubal Early and his corps to the Shenandoah in June, with orders to engage Union forces there and, if possible, threaten Washington, D.C. Lemuel A. Abbott, by June of 1864, was a first lieutenant and commander of Company E in the 10th Vermont, and on 9 July fought at the Battle of Monocacy. Though a Confederate victory, it delayed their advance upon the capital and allowed a substantial Union force to repel Lieutenant General Early's army at the Battle of Fort Stevens. By September of that year, the regiment was assigned to Colonel William Emerson's 1st Brigade, in Brigadier General James Ricketts' 3rd Division, of Major General Horatio Wright's 6th Corps, in the Army of the Shenandoah, commanded by Major General Philip Sheridan. Sheridan had by mid-September fought a series of battles that slowly pushed Lieutenant General Early's Army of the Valley further south. Having discovered that a portion of the Confederate Army had departed the valley, Major General Sheridan decided to strike Lieutenant General Early's camp outside of the town of Winchester, Virginia. At 2 a.m. on 19 September 1864, First Lieutenant Abbott and the 10th Vermont began their march on the Berryville Turnpike toward the eastern outskirts of Winchester. By daylight, the regiment, along with the rest of the 1st Brigade, were making their way through the Berryville Canyon, when First Lieutenant Abbott spotted Major General Sheridan on horseback. We were on the eve of the most brilliant, spectacular battle of the war, at any rate that I had seen, and my ideal genius developed by the great Civil War, Sheridan, was to lead us, and the valor of the renowned 6th Corps, his pet of all the splendid corps of as grand and valiant an army as ever existed, the Army of the Potomac, was about being placed by him at the most important point in the line of battle, ready to do and die for him. The 10th Vermont formed with the 5-Regiment 1st Brigade, just north of the Berryville Turnpike, on the eastern bank of an Abraham Creek tributary. In front of them was terrain pockmarked with hills, canyons, and creeks. The Confederates of Ramseur's division were in a line of battle behind a creek that formed a semicircle with a sloping ravine about 50 feet deep, by First Lieutenant Abbott's estimation. The Union first line of battle consisted of the 10th Vermont and the 3rd Division in the center and directly facing the Confederates. The 2nd Division on the left flank, which had to cross a steeper ravine of about 90 feet south of the turnpike, and the 19th Corps on the right flank, which to its immediate front were dense woods. At about 11:40 a.m. on 19 September, the 6th and 19th Corps began their advance against the Confederate division of Major General Ramseur, and almost immediately lost its cohesion. If the historian hereafter accuses the 3rd Division of breaking in this assault, it will be but fair to state the extenuating circumstances, for a portion of the 1st Brigade was similarly situated, and we got no direct effective flank help from our critics on either flank during the fight. The 2nd Division, having nothing in its immediate front in the ravine, obliqued to the left to attack it, meeting a separate Confederate force, which was what caused that division to pull away from the 3rd Division's left. At the same time, the 19th Corps pulled away from our right, causing 2 wide gaps. Despite having both flanks uncovered, First Lieutenant Abbott, the 10th Vermont, and the 2 brigades of the 3rd Division continued their advance into an intense artillery fire. At noon, in the midst of a perfect bedlam caused by the roar of artillery, shrieking, bursting, hurtling shells, and the voices of many officers, pitched high so as to be heard above the din, giving orders, the assault was made through the thin strip of timber in our front toward Winchester, when we briefly halted and laid on the ground, and then across an open field beyond the wood in all about 250 yards where I was, midst a perfect storm of solid shot and shell, rattling musketry on my right and front, and whizzing many balls without being able to fire a rifle at first. So well was the enemy in front protected by the lay of the ground and its rail breastworks. We persistently advanced, though, but it took a great deal of nerve and willpower to do it in an open field without the slightest cover, all the time amidst a perfect storm of iron and leaden hail, and the cries of the wounded and dying, which were disconcerting. Though First Lieutenant Abbott, the 10th Vermont, and the 1st Brigade managed to brave the heavy artillery fire from the Confederates in their front, the 2nd Brigade of the 3rd Division on their right suffered heavily from the artillery and a flank attack. Under this pressure, they broke for the rear. The 1st Brigade was now on its own. Major General Wright, commander of the 6th Corps, witnessed the dire situation and sent the 1st Division, which was in reserve, to form on the right of the beleaguered 3rd Division. The 2 corps moved handsomely to the front, driving for a time everything before them. After a considerable advance of the infantry and artillery, a most determined charge of the enemy was made on the left of the 19th Corps, crowding it back, and then turning the flank of the 3rd Division, 6th Corps, threatened a disaster to the day. It was too early in the battle to choose to put in the reserve of the 6th Corps, but seeing that the fate of the day depended on the employment of this force, I at once sent it in. As First Lieutenant Abbott recognized the precarious situation of the 10th Vermont and the remainder of the 3rd Division, he spotted Brigadier General David Allen Russell, commander of the 1st Division, personally leading his men into position on the 3rd Division's right flank. The appearance of his column greatly relieved us, as it drew the concentrated artillery fire from our column by the enemy largely to his. The whole battle scene at this moment, at this point, was one of appalling grandeur, one which no beholders could ever forget, provided they could keep their nerve well enough to preserve their presence of mind sufficiently to take in the situation midst the screeching shells and appalling musketry fire. The splendid appearance of General Russell's division elicited a cry of admiration from all who saw it. It was the supreme moment or turning point in the great tide of battle. It was the grandest, best, and most welcome sight I ever saw in a tight space in battle. Just as First Lieutenant Abbott witnessed the arrival of the 1st Division to their right, the Confederate line fired their last shots from their first position, and he received 2 wounds around his mouth, which he initially thought were mortal. It was the enemy's last volley when it saw our reserve coming at them so determinedly that put a stop to my fighting for several months. And but for our reserve coming on the field just as it did, I would have been worse riddled than I was by the enemy, and killed even, lying on the ground wounded, as I was wholly exposed where I lay close on their works, not a rod away, the ground sloping towards them. The 1st Division's arrival managed to break Confederate resistance in their first position, but the overall cost was heavy for the 6th Corps. Brigadier General Russell was killed in the act of placing his men, and Captain Lucius T. Hunt, who took command of the 10th Vermont during the assault, summed up the state of the 3rd Division. The fire of the enemy's artillery while in the woods was sufficiently hot and accurate to try the best discipline of the troops. The regiment suffered there its heaviest loss, the greatest being its gallant commander, Major Edwin Dillingham. The general alignment of the line was a good bit disturbed, but the advance was not checked. He talks about the men of the 10th Vermont advancing on the Confederate artillery, which was hastily withdrawn, and continues, "Halting and rectifying my line, I was informed by a staff officer that the troops were retiring, and therefore withdrew my command, at first in good order, but afterward, being involved among other troops, it shared the general confusion which then occurred for a time in consequence of disorder on our right, and a flank fire in that direction." After committing his reserve, Major General Wright commented on the end of the 6th Corps' assault upon the 1st Confederate position. The 1st Division moved admirably on the enemy, and the batteries with canister opened upon them with murderous effect, the 2, meaning the 1st and 3rd Divisions, driving them back in much disorder. This was the turning point of the conflict. Getty on the left, meaning the 2nd Division, with part of Ricketts' division not involved in the break, maintained their front and fell back only to secure their lines and preserve their connection with the right. From noon to 4 p.m., the 3rd Division reorganized themselves as the Union Army continued to push the Confederates closer to the town of Winchester. By 5 p.m., Ricketts' division, including the 10th Vermont, participated in the final assault until dark, when the Confederate Army retreated. First Lieutenant Abbott, due to his severe wounds, did not participate in the evening's fight, and would be in a hospital for several months in recovery. He eventually returned to the 10th Vermont, and by December of 1864 was promoted to captain. Lemuel A. Abbott decided to write his book, Personal Recollections and Civil War Diary, 1864, after he happened to find his diary in an old chest 38 years after the war ended. Having continued service in the U.S. Army after the war out west, now Major Abbott, though there were several reasons he published his book, sought to correct what he saw was wrong with contemporary scholarship. Finally, what decided the author to publish this diary now, at once, old age being upon him, was to try to correct false history in connection with the first assault at Sheridan's Battle of Winchester, Virginia. Besides this, he was requested to publish his personal observations in July 1908, just before leaving Washington, D.C., of every battle he was in during the Civil War by the librarian of the War Department. While Lemuel A. Abbott did disagree with some parts of a previous history of the 10th Vermont, published by the regimental chaplain, Edwin M. Haynes, most of the issues with the description of the Third Battle of Winchester concerned the terrain, which he had a firm grasp of while serving in the post-Civil War U.S. Army. For nearly a score of years, while in the 6th U.S. Cavalry, I, as well as other officers, had to map the wild country over which we scouted for the hostile Indians on the plains between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. We used the prismatic compass bearings and odometer measurements, at the same time sketching the country passed over, showing all springs, rivulets, and streams, their bank formations, all divides, buttes, mountains, etc., with elaborate notes from which all public maps have since been made of that country, now largely in use. Lemuel A. Abbott took it upon himself to apply his almost 20 years of experience in topography and produce an exhaustive picture of the terrain on the east side of Winchester, Virginia, on the day of battle, 19 September 1864. Not only that, he also toured the battlefield and hired a photographer who took 11 pictures of the ground he advanced across with the 10th Vermont, and included it in his book. Thank you for listening to the 29th episode. The link to First Lieutenant Abbott's book is now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, you will find a picture of Lemuel A. Abbott at the rank of Major sometime around the turn of the century. Links to all social media accounts are located at the top of each web page, so give the podcast a follow. And if you enjoy the content that First Person Civil War Podcast provides, please give a review on your app of choice. In 2 weeks' time, Second Lieutenant Lot D. Young of Company H, 4th Kentucky Confederate, provides next episode's first-person account at the Battle of Dallas. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.